Officially, European civilization began with the Roman Empire. The Romans constructed public toilets, bathhouses, and thermal baths. They built roads, bridges, and dams. Then, for some unknown reason, Europe plunged into the darkness of the Middle Ages. A bit of information about what occurred in Europe during the Middle Ages. Night pots were emptied out of windows, often onto the heads of passers-by, leading to the invention of wide-brimmed hats. The well-known gesture of a man tipping his hat to a woman originally meant to shake off feces from the hat. Filth flowed through the streets, resulting in the invention of high-heeled shoes and tall platforms. They even invented mini stilts for walking on the streets. Domestic animals, horses, cows, and pigs, lived in cities, adding manure to already dirty cities. Medieval travelers, when describing Paris, noted that the stench from the city spread several kilometers. Not only the common folk, but also the so-called nobility degraded. In their castles, they held endless balls and feasted. An ordinary pastime was flea hunting, on themselves and their table neighbors. Lovers wore a special amulet around their neck to carry their beloved's flea on their chest. Ladies carried a dog to attract fleas, since a dog has a higher body temperature. Lice and syphilis, which practically everyone suffered from at that time, led to baldness, prompting the invention of wigs to conceal the absence of hair. The nobility bathed twice in their lifetime, during baptism and at their wedding. People of that time emitted a strong odor, and to mask this foul smell, perfumes were invented. Hygiene and medicine are indicators of societal development. What about medicine? In those days, almost all diseases were treated with bloodletting. Doctors did not wash their hands during childbirth. This led to 30% of women getting postpartum fever caused by blood poisoning, sepsis. More than half of them died. The connection between unwashed hands of doctors and postpartum fever was first discovered in the mid-19th century by Ignaz Semmelweis, a brilliant obstetrician and scientist working in Budapest. He noticed that hospital doctors often went straight from the autopsy room, where they dissected cadavers to help women in labor. The respectable doctors of the time did not wash their hands after working with cadavers. They just hastily wiped them off and went to deliver the babies. Unfortunately, the scientific community of the time ridiculed Semmelweis's ideas. It wasn't until 18 years after Semmelweis's publication that his theory was recognized. Mandatory hand disinfection of medical personnel before childbirth was introduced into the practice of maternity hospitals in the second half of the 19th century. Let's move to the 17th and 19th centuries. At balls and banquets, diners used the restroom around the corner or curtain it off. After the castle was completely fouled with feces, the nobles would move to another castle, dirty it, and then occupy the next one. Here, by the way, there is something to ponder. Why around the corner or behind the curtain? Were there no toilets there, or did the sewage system not work? If there were no toilets at all, then the castles were indeed industrial buildings of those times. Perhaps factories or grain elevators that were repurposed after a global catastrophe. If the sewers didn't work, why? What event plunged the entire European civilization into the darkness of the Middle Ages? By the way, something similar happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union in some republics. Specialists left the cities, and chaos reigned. There was no electricity, no heating, and no water supply. We remember the stories from the 90s on television, where in abandoned apartment buildings, electricity from a gasoline generator was sold by the hour, and heating in freezing houses was organized by installing a small metal stove in the kitchen. In other words, there was a certain civilization in Europe in those times, something reminiscent of the USSR of those years, in which there was a developed industrial economy, a civilization, and then, after the catastrophe, this civilization collapsed. Let's get back to locks. Is there such an example in modern times? As it turns out, there is. Let me read you an article. It's about the city of Johannesburg in South Africa. Johannesburg is a modern city with skyscrapers, and South Africa had its own space program. The country had nuclear technology and weapons. The world's first heart transplant surgery was performed in South Africa. Our subscriber, who lived in Cape Town at the time, tells us about it. And then, at one point, treacherously, Without a declaration of war, a couple million locals invaded Johannesburg, ushering in the era of the African Reconquista. They were simply leaving their homes and going where life seemed more promising. Our subscriber was living in Johannesburg at the time and told the following. In the middle of the workday, something strange happened. The doors of the office center swung open and several thousand locals poured into the building, disorganized but cheerful and positive. They arrived with their belongings and food. They asked not to be disturbed and asked to get on with their work and began to occupy what they saw as inefficiently used space. They spread evenly throughout the offices, occupying empty chairs, sofas, and armchairs. They occupied the restrooms and hallways, taking away all the valuable jewelry from the employees. The building was buzzing with life and joyful bustle. They plucked birds, cooked food in the meeting rooms, and showered in the restrooms. When asked impolitely how, they simply replied that they would now live here. When asked why, they replied that it was best for everyone. The police were called. The police did not come. They were told that the same chaos was going on in their neighborhoods. So those who could, quietly, began to flee into the suburbs and towards Cape Town, while simultaneously erecting protective barriers, trenches, rows of electrified barbed wire. After the mass exodus, the building owners wondered what to do. They came up with a plan. They decided that if they cut off the invaders' electricity, water, and sewage, they would leave the building themselves and they returned to the savannah. So they shut everything off. The invaders didn't even notice. It seems they didn't have electricity, water, or sewage in the savannah either. We asked our subscriber where they relieved themselves then. The subscriber replied that they themselves had pondered this question for a long time, and when they found out the answer, they were greatly surprised. It turned out that while the invaders were settling into the buildings, they could not understand the functionality of the elevator shafts. After opening the elevator doors, they pondered for a long time, looking down and wondering what the hole was for. And then, they guessed and gave credit to the intelligence of skyscraper builders. They decided that they had cleverly invented everything and started defecating and throwing garbage into the elevator shafts. According to our subscriber, the crowd of invaders, having taken possession of the building, on average for 10 years, will fill it with shit and garbage up to the roof. And then, as in good prehistoric times, they would move to a new place, occupying a new skyscraper. Besides, according to our hero, a new informal service has appeared in Johannesburg. Some tough guys were offering building owners the service of repossessing occupied buildings. At some point, a couple hundred heavily armed tough guys would quietly and calmly start reclaiming the building, roughly kicking out all the occupants without waking them up, until they came to their senses and didn't realize what was happening. They closed all the entrances and exits, dug trenches, stretched wire, and electrocuted them. Then, having restored the building to its original condition, they put it back into operation. The tallest 173-meter-high residential building in Africa, with an interior atrium, was famous among citizens for its unprecedented views of the city. In the 1990s, after the end of apartheid, gangs took over the abandoned high-rise, turning the luxury condominium into a hotbed of crime, drug abuse, and AIDS. The lower part of the atrium became a 5-story dump. A very similar situation occurred in Europe several hundred years ago. A more civilized society built castles, and in my opinion, these castles were the industrial buildings of the time. Then something happened, and new people came along and started using the castles as they saw fit, having banquets where they defecated in corners and behind curtains. And when it became impossible to stay in the castle, they moved to a new castle. And in conclusion, independent researchers often use new terminology to explain certain phenomena. For example, cargo cult. The author of these lines proposed a new term, reverse cargo cult, or Johannesburg effect, when buildings from a more advanced civilization are used for unintended purposes. By the way, there are many such examples in our history, and we will tell you about them in our upcoming videos. That's all for now. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon. Goodbye.